Welcome everyone to our Difficult Conversation series. My name is José Barzola. I am president at the Conflict Resolution Alliance. We are a local nonprofit that develops and supports peace builders in Hawaii. The Difficult Conversation series are 6 interactive virtual workshops that will assist you to be ready to have difficult conversations in your professional and personal lives. Today, we start with session 1, which will focus on exploring racism in conflict resolution with Amrita Mallik, Ranney, and myself, José Barzola. Thank you for joining us today to discuss how implicit racial bias can affect conflict resolution processes and learn how to incorporate anti-racist principles into your peace building and conflict resolution. To get us started, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Katie.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ranney, and I am the Special Programs Coordinator for the Mediation Center of the Pacific. I'm also President-elect for the Conflict Resolution Alliance, so I'll be taking Jose's position next year. Thank you very much for coming and being part of this. And then I'll turn it to my other colleague, Amrita.
Aloha, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. We're excited to see such a dynamic and large group participate in this conversation. For those of you who I have not yet gotten the chance to meet, my name is Amrita Mallik. I'm a member of the Conflict Resolution Alliance and a past president when we were ACR. And I currently use my skills as a mediator and facilitator at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. So again, thank you everyone for joining us for the Difficult Conversation series for our first session, Exploring Racism and Conflict Resolution. Our goal today is to help develop an understanding about the vocabulary and what we mean when we talk about anti-racism, and then enable us to look at our processes and our practices as peacemakers and conflict resolvers to ensure that we are building equity into our approaches. So that, let me just go ahead and... So we'd love to just get a...
Join the meeting.
We'd love to just get a start of seeing sort of where people are at and how they're feeling today as we enter into this conversation, acknowledging that some of the things we're talking about may be very familiar to some people, and others it might be foreign or new. We just would love to get a sense of that. So if you wouldn't mind going to this link, it's pollev.com/Amrita Mallik 173. And once there, I have a poll set up where you can just enter in a word or two, just a thought about, you know, what you're feeling today as we enter into this space. And I'm going to give it a few seconds, and then I'm going to go ahead and share so we can see where we are with each other. Okay, so as we're entering into the session, we're seeing some happiness, some openness. That's great. Gratitude, wanting to learn new things. Excitement, that's inspiring to us as people who do this work and engage in this regularly. It's not always an easy conversation. And it isn't always an easy space to enter into. There are some tough emotions
Join
that
the meeting.
raised and need to be managed. So we are very grateful and inspired that you were all so open and willing and welcome to this conversation. Excellent. And we're seeing also some curiosities. Again, that idea of openness. People feeling even keeled, that's good. Maybe a little bit, you know, let's hold back and see where this conversation goes. That's completely fair. Hopeful, I think we're all here because we're hungry for these conversations and to develop that shared understanding. So thank you for sharing that. That's a big one. I think we're seeing that from a number of people, so that's wonderful. Eager, interested. People are also busy. Well, thank you so much for taking your time. I know we're all managing more than we ever thought we were going to during this pandemic, this crisis. So thank you for sharing your time with us and your energy and some of that space and grace with all of us here today. I like that people are pumped, right? Keep that energy going, and definitely we want to encourage you to bring that curiosity and that energy as we go through this session, and then especially as we have the chance to interact with each other and have a little bit more discussion. Excellent. So with that in mind, I'm going to switch back to the slides, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Katie to walk us through the outline.
Sure. I just want to make sure that you all know where we're going to be going with this. So first, we are going to, like with any successful mediation or facilitation, we're going to set some ground rules for this. And then we will introduce some concepts, some definitions, some terms, so that we're all kind of on the same page, and introduce a little bit of context on how this can affect our conflict resolution processes, whether we are professional mediators and facilitators, professional community builders, or if this is just within your own life or within your own workspace on conflict resolution processes. So we're going to give a little context from our perspectives, and then we'll go into small group discussions where you'll be able to meet and have a more intimate private conversation with some of the other participants here, and then a share out kind of at the end, just to kind of get a good feeling of where everybody is and what maybe we've learned or concepts that we've brought up.
And I'm back again. This is Jose. So some ground rules for today's discussion. We're gonna definitely be sure to keep yourself muted when you're not speaking. As I stated earlier, you are actually going to all be muted for the first portion of today's presentation, but later on we'll be utilizing some of these ground rules specifically. As you participate, please say your name first. Please keep things that are said here confidential. This is a safe space that we are trying to nurture here. It is encouraged to challenge the idea or the practice being voiced. Not the person specifically, but voicing them. No judgments or disclaimers of self-judgments. Speak for yourself, such as I statements, to state opinions or feelings, not as I heard someone say, because that will not help in our dialogue today. Respect others' differences, definitely, and give others the benefit of the doubt. But more than anything, you know, we want to be able to nurture a sense of space, safety, and to be able to lean into our discomfort today to share and hopefully grow from this experience. So as I stated earlier, we're here with the Conflict Resolution Alliance. We are a local nonprofit, and our mission is to promote and support peaceful conflict resolution and collaborative decision making at all its levels in our society, whether it's in our home, school, ohana, workplace, or community. We are a collaborative of mediators, arbitrators, facilitators, educators, social workers, lawyers, psychologists, child family advocates, problem solvers, concerned citizens, all dedicated to the pursuit of peace. Actually, one thing I just did was I'm allowing every participant to rename yourself. So I know a lot of you have your names on there, but if you can, after your name, add on which category you most connect with. Are you a mediator, arbitrator, facilitator, educator, or if it's not one of those topics, please include it in there. It'll just give us a better sense as a community, you know, who is here with us today. And also as we separate into breakout rooms later, it'll have a better sense and picture of where we're all coming from. And Katie, anything else?
Yeah, and we do want to thank everybody who is here. One of the added benefits of participating in this series is that you will have a membership to the Conflict Resolution Alliance through all of 2021. So as the president during that term, I'm really looking forward to working with all of you, to hearing from all of you. And as we go forward, you know, one of the main parts of CRA is to connect peace builders, to connect conflict resolvers in Hawaii. So if there is an event that you would like to have coming up later, or more on these lines, we'd love to hear from you. We'd love to really have you be active members of our community to help create a culture of peace building and conflict resolution in Hawaii.
Great. And I just wanted to tack on there, again, if our goal is to create that culture of collaboration, of openness, and of connection between all of us and the communities we serve, we thank you again for participating in this conversation, because we feel that it's important to center conversations around race, around difference, and find ways to make sure that we are elevating all voices and welcoming all voices and managing that in a way that our systems and our processes and the work that we do, both formally and informally, is supporting an anti-racist world and is engaging really directly with promoting equity and equality. And with that note, that ties into also, for those of us who are mediators, the expectations of the model standards of conduct for our practices. You can see that The goals are to create competency, again, making sure that we are empowered and educated in engaging across cultures, engaging across identities, and being able to connect and help everyone from different backgrounds resolve conflicts in a way that is meaningful. And also ensuring a good quality of the process. Again, this is another opportunity to look at our processes with a critical eye to see what can we be doing better to promote equal access, to promote equity, and again, to make sure that the voices that need to are being recognized and that we are doing our part to promote equality to both and equity and access to the process, but also in order to really make sure that people are getting what they need to solve the problems that they bring to us for help with. We wanted to take some time to discuss definitions, again, just to make sure that we are all on the same page and to provide a little bit of context. And I wanted to give credit to my colleagues, Andrea Hermosura and Rebecca Delafield, both at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. They are letting us use these slides that we've created, and they're in a very generous way. So wanted to acknowledge that and also uplift some of the amazing people who are doing this work throughout our communities.
So this is Katie. We'll start with the basic definition, something that, two words that get used very often with sort of the assumption that everyone kind of knows what they are, and that's race and ethnicity. Sometimes used interchangeably. They aren't actually, they're very separate concepts, but they are both they're both constructed concepts. So there is no real sort of definite scientific concept of race. Race is socially constructed. It is a categorization that was based on observation of physical differences, and in general, the main difference would be skin color. And it has really no connection to any sort of biological definition. And when race is used to describe, differences in outcomes, medical outcomes, it turns out that when all the different variables in those studies are controlled for, things such as socioeconomic status, geographic location, and all of that, race differences tend to disappear. So race differences tend to disappear. And it really is that socioeconomic and other qualities that are a more clear indicator if you're wanting to understand differences between people. Ethnicity is tied more towards culture, so it is a self-constructed concept, and it is what ties certain groups of people together based on another amorphous sort of concept of culture, but that is sort of an accumulation of practices, beliefs, language that tie people together. It is sometimes geographically related, but not always, because there's always a diaspora. And it's kind of important to know that these ideas don't come from a genetic or biological foundation. The idea of race is actually coming from a human urge to categorize and to be able to distance people themselves from each other. So as this quote says, race is the child of racism, not the father. The idea that wanting to distance or put down another set of people is what kind of led to a lot of these ideas of, oh, well, a certain race is inherently one way or another, hardworking or lazy, all of those things. It gets into the concepts of like phrenology, where like the shape of your head is going to define who you are as a person. It's pseudoscience. So just knowing where that's sort of a base definition.
And just to echo what Katie was saying, and with the Ta-Nehisi Coates quote, by acknowledging that race is constructed, it in no way invalidates the importance of race in our lives and in the interactions and the way that we are categorized. And insofar as it is used to create hierarchies and to uplift groups and oppress others, race becomes just really important and very interwoven into all of the systems for our society. Just wanted to underscore that point as we move forward.
No, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Amrita. It is just because, in fact, even more so because it was human created, because we are talking about human relationships, it becomes a key term, a key concept going forward.
So to go off a little bit of what Katie has been talking about, the concept of racism, system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on the social interpretation of how one looks or race that. So Katie kind of touched upon already how race does not biologically exist. Yeah, how we identify with race is so powerful, and it influences our experiences and shapes our lives, especially in society where we've made it so prominent. If you think about like your census, you know, you're actually asked to identify your ethnicity and then separately your race, and on so many other forms out there. So we are in a way perpetuating the concept of, although it's not biologically existing, it does exist within our society. And it is important to acknowledge it, but in a way we have to acknowledge how we're perpetuating it within our systems or structures of our organization, and possibly intake forms that we utilize. So as the slide goes, unfairly disadvantages some individuals and communities, unfairly advantages other individuals and communities, that saps the strength of the whole society through waste of human resource. One of the things in a society that privileges really on white people in whiteness as a beauty or something to strive for. And you can look at this a lot in various cultures where having a clear skin tone is seen as beautiful. And so one of the biggest things that's coming out now is in South Asian community, a lot of the makeup companies out there who were using little bits of bleach in so that women could bleach their skin a little bit to be a little lighter, because that would ideally lead to what is considered beautiful or has been perpetuated as what can be considered beautiful within those communities. And this is not just seen in the South Asian community, this is seen widely around various communities all around the world. So it's just something to kind of be conscientious of, how exactly are we perpetuating this, and how are we, also this kind of leads me to, we don't have a slide about tokenism, but I did want to talk about a little bit about that specifically, especially in my own experience going on these various webinars or workshops, especially when it comes to this field, whether, I mean, my full time is in higher education, but working within the field of conflict resolution as a mediator facilitator, many times not only do I clearly, especially now that we do all these events in Zoom, you can do the grid format and you can kind of see everybody without having to look around the room. And yeah, most of the times I'm not only the youngest person in some of these sessions, but I'm also the only person sometimes that looks like myself or identifies, although yes, I may potentially pass off as certain ethnic backgrounds, you know, deep down I identify as being Peruvian because that's where I was born, and I'm not identifying Hispanic or Latino. That's other terminology that we don't have all day today to get into the logistics of that. But what I always suggest is just ask people how they want to identify. That's really, I think, at the essence of everything, but also being conscientious of what subtle judgments we may have within our own everyday language or practices that we may not be conscientious of. And we're definitely going to get further into some of those tidbits a little bit later as we move along. But in order, spirit of moving along, we're going to move on now to levels of racism.
Great, thank you, Jose. And I just wanted to share, I think, I'm just gonna go back for a quick second. As Jose was illustrating for us, you know, the ways our appearance comes out, or the way that we're perceived, mediates how we interact with the world and how we are treated. So that's why we have the image of the two sisters. These are genetic identical twins. I mean, I don't know if they're identical, forgive me, they're fraternal, but they're genetically identical in that they have the same genetic background. Yet the way that those genes express themselves completely change how the world sees them based upon what race they're assigned and how they interact. And I definitely want to give a shout out to the person who added about the vanishing half. fascinating novel looking at the way colorism plays out in society and what it means to perform as white or perform as Black. So again, just thinking of racism as that system and how your appearance then defines who you are and how you move through society, and how we as mediators and conflict resolution professionals will interact and engage with others who come and use our services. So again, just the idea of levels of racism, I like to think of this in terms of the different levels at which we see the system play out, kind of at the micro level, at a meso level, and at a macro level. So at the highest levels, it's structural. It's how our systems within society are created, our political systems, our economic systems that privilege certain groups, prioritize certain groups at the detriment of others. We'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide, but again, sort of the next level down is at the institutional level. So any of the institutions or organizations that we are part of. I know we have several here from the university system. We have other different groups, different organizations represented on this training. How do the systems of racism operate at your institution with the decisions that get made and the way different people are treated or the different opportunities that come into different individuals? Then it's at the personal level. We have that level of that micro level of interaction, our own individual prejudices, biases, our own discriminations, and the way that we interact and engage interpersonally to create those disparities and those differentiated ways that we treat each other. And then at the very micro level, internalized, what we have absorbed, what are our implicit biases, what do we carry with us in how we react to, say, one of those twins versus another. And the way that plays out then is racism occurs in different places in society at those different levels. So we see at those sort of highest organizational, at the highest levels of society, you see it at different the ways that things are described in different sectors. For example, like it plays out in real estate, it plays out in access to housing, in who gets preferential treatment for education, and what opportunities are created really by accident of birth throughout the entire societal system. It occurs for individuals, again, who we are, how we interact, who we choose to interact with, and then how we interact as part of the organizations, and then finally at those macro levels of society. And institutions, we really want to address institutional responsibility to address these issues, looking at institutional practices. Who gets hired? How do we recruit? Who do we bring in? Who gets promoted? And then who do we look towards for leadership? And that is, we'd like to have that in the background as we challenge each of you to think about how that plays out in the organizations that you belong to, and how it plays out in the way that you engage in these practices. You have these conversations, you create these spaces as mediators and facilitators to do this work.
And I'm back. So this portion, we're going to talk about biases, discrimination, and microaggressions, specifically to kind of break down the differences between them, because occasionally I've gotten questions that, what's the difference? So racial biases, we're looking at really the implicit and implicit associations or attitudes assigned to racial ethnic groups. Many times you may hear about, well, if it's a stereotype, there must be some truth to it. Just because whether there is or there isn't doesn't make it right, and doesn't really give, I think, anyone the true authority to be able to perpetuate that, because all it does is just continues the cycle in the system of oppression that we have been continuously living in. So discrimination, behaviors that can result from these biases, such as who has, if a certain person of, let's say, darker skin happens to be walking by your car, do you lock your doors? Is it something automatically that you do? Do you maybe, in your practices, little things that you may not even notice, like I'm gonna cross the street to the other side of the street as I'm walking because somebody's coming from certain ethnic or race. And it's these little things that we do on our everyday decisions that we make that we might not even be, might be done just subconsciously. Taking the pen away because we're thinking, oh, somebody might steal that pen. Little things like that. Just if you can get into the nitty-grittiness of it all. So microaggressions, the everyday slight indignities to put down to insults that people of color, women, LGBT populations, or those who are marginalized experience in their day-to-day interactions with people. One microaggression that I've been recently dealing with is, well, I've dealt with it for some time, but because Spanish is my first language, how many people go around and just say hola? And yes, they are possibly just trying to be kind and interact in my native language, but sometimes that is really the extent of what they know. It's a little bit different than to like engage in a conversation with me in Spanish, as opposed to just throwing out that one word. I guess here in Hawaii specifically, how many just go around throwing out the word aloha as a greeting, but who actually will engage in the native Hawaiian language and be able to actually speak the language as opposed to just saying aloha. Recently, I had a training through a institute in California. It's a digital one, and I was the only person there from Hawaii. And yes, it was 6 a.m. here, and there was different times over there. And I do my usual introduction. And recently, I actually haven't started. I have taken aloha out of my own language from emails, from conversations. I just go with good morning, hello. Even in my emails, I go dear. Just other formalities that I can utilize to try to be as neutral as possible. And so I introduced myself with good morning and did my brief intro. And then at the very end, the main facilitator was like, well, aloha, I hope life is really great in Hawaii. So that in a sense is, I know they may have not meant anything bad by it, and they were probably just trying to connect, but once more, it is a form of microaggression. It's similar to somebody saying konnichiwa to someone who is Japanese, but necessarily not having further engagement in that, or saying namaste to somebody who happens to be of South Asian community. So it's just, the lines go deeper and deeper. But yeah, so just wanted to give some examples of my own experience.
Jose, if you don't mind to add on to what you're saying, with these biases, it is good to kind of recognize that everyone has biases, but the importance is being able to examine your biases, to understand where they're coming from, and to determine, is my behavior a result from that that already established bias, or am I actually interacting and reacting to the person and their behaviors? So this kind of slope or generation of discrimination, which can lead to that, you know, racism on many levels, is coming from an unexamined, unchallenged bias within yourself. So don't feel bad about having biases or assumptions. Take the time and the effort to examine, how am I speaking? What am I saying? Is that something that is coming from this you know, level bias, as opposed to actually acting and interacting with the person?
Yeah, no, thank you, Katie. I thank you for that. And one portion I didn't even add was just this conversation doesn't even really go into it too much, but I always try to throw it in there, is gender neutrality, just being conscientious about that. How many times in our everyday language do we utilize quote unquote guys? Hey guys, how's everybody doing? While there might be a plethora of women in the room, but then there's only one man there, or maybe there's no men at all, but you're just utilizing this. Once more, an example from when I was an undergrad and I was doing trainings on sexual assaults for the Women's Center at the institution, and that word quickly got removed from my language. And so, yeah, it's just being conscientious of the community that you're approaching, that you're entering into, because the last thing you want to do is to find yourself indirectly insulting or hurting someone, because we don't know where people are coming from. We don't know how they're approaching the situation and what may have happened literally a few seconds before they entered the room, for, you know, sitting down at your table to, whether it's to mediate, facilitate, or just have a dialogue. So I think the best of a clean slate that we can provide, and the more of an open, safe space that we can nurture, the better it'll be, not only to strengthen communication, but also to be able to effectively collaborate on the desired, you know, project or situation that we're dealing with at the moment. So, but I will turn it over to Kate now.
Hi. So we're going to talk a little bit about whiteness, because that is an important concept when it comes to the discussion about racism. And a lot of it, I mean, in our society, there is an inherent privilege of being white, of being perceived as white, for those who may be passing. And this is an advantage. It is on a structural, institutional, and often interpersonal level within our society. And the privilege can be small. It is advantages in certain areas, often unseen. And then there is that system of white supremacy where it is a system of domination, a system of accelerating the benefits and advantages of those who are white or just perceived as such. White supremacy is also one that gets taken further into a very violent state, wherein certain trigger words such as heritage, I'm protecting my heritage or my history, but the heritage that they're talking about is whiteness as opposed to any specific cultural heritage within it. And then that kind of goes beyond. So, and that this is something that's prevalent here, it's prevalent in the United States, it's prevalent worldwide, honestly.
Yeah, so I wanted to take a second to just flesh this out with everyone. Again, thinking again, racism is that system of oppression. Well, that means that one group is uplifted, and here whiteness is the normative standard. It is the privileged, powerful group. So it's just important to talk about that as it helps us illustrate that idea of the system of the hierarchy. I think I'm going to turn it over to Jose now to talk about anti-racism.
Here I am again. All right. So yes, so anti-racist or anti-racism, anti-racist, person who opposes racism in all its forms. Now, I'll start out with a quote. The beauty of anti-racism is that you don't have to pretend to be free of racism to be an anti-racist. Anti-racism is the commitment to fight racism wherever you find it, including in yourself. And it is truly the only way forward. Joma Olo, author of So You Want to Talk About Race. So to really try to create an equal society, we must commit to making unbiased choices, to being anti-racist in all aspects of our lives. But as it states, it's so important to understand the biases that are instilled with you from day one. I mean, just from, as a man, what are things that were instilled in me when I was growing up? It was like, oh, let's go play soccer. Let's do active sports. It wasn't like, let's sit around and, play with dolls or other gender norms that are pushed upon one. As it is, one of the things that I've really tried to take on in being very conscientious of myself is just how are stereotypical men who are, Latino or Latinx perceived in society. Many times it's perpetuated that they are dominant, they are loud, and so for those specific reasons, I always take a step back and make sure to not be the one in the room having the full dialogue, being the center of attention. Yes, today I happen to be presenting. I normally try not to be in front of the camera presenting, but I just felt that specifically today's topic was just so important to have this dialogue, especially with everything that's been going on. It is so essential to have these dialogues. And so being anti-racist is fighting against racism. Racism takes several forms and works most often in tandem with at least one other form to reinforce racist ideas, behavior, and policy. Some types of racism are individual racism, which we talked about, which refers to maybe beliefs or attitudes, actions, individuals that support or perpetuate racism in conscious and unconscious ways. So I go back to, let's lean into our discomfort. How does, let's say, our our political, our religious, our training for what we do as educators or facilitators or arbitrators, how are those practices potentially perpetuating racist actions within the work that we do? And how can we change the narrative a bit? So another one is interpersonal racism, the racism that occurs between individuals. These are public expressions of racism involving slurs, biases, hateful words or actions. And some of the other sessions in the series will address specifically some of those. So I'm very excited for some of our future speakers for that. And so I definitely encourage that. But then beyond interpersonal racism, we talk about institutional racism that occurs within your organization. And that's really where it's probably, these are discriminatory treatments, unfair policies, biased practices based on race as a result. Yes, there's an HR department that can help you out with, alleviating some of those discomforts, but not everything has been covered. There's probably stuff embedded within the organization that's been there for so long that unless someone brings it up or addresses it, it's going to continue. And that's part of this cycle of oppression that perpetuates, unfortunately, where we tend to be and that discourages. I've worked at institutions or of higher education where we led, so our main marketing was, first generation low income students, and this is in New York, and I happened to be the only person that spoke Spanish out of at least 500 employees there. The admissions office would reach out to me to speak to the parents of a prospective student because they didn't have somebody on staff that spoke the language. So were those racist practices? They definitely were not inclusive practices. And so that brings me to my next level of inclusivity. So as we look at not only our biases and the racism with ourselves, what lack of inclusivity are we perpetuating without even really being aware of that? So take it away. Who's next?
You shift back to me now. Thank you, Jose. Again, just as we talk about this, you'll also hear the word power come out a lot, and its cousin, privilege, which Katie will talk about in a second. The reason we bring up power is because racism is an exercise of power. It is a way to, again, to privilege a group and to enable them to have more, be more, do more at the expense of another group that is lower in the hierarchy. And again, it's negotiated at that interpersonal level, but also at the institutional level, and specifically for us. If we are problem solvers, if we are stepping into that role as a mediator, as a facilitator, or even just in any of the ways that we engage to help resolve conflicts in the world around us, we then occupy a position of relative power and authority in different situations. So how can we be cognizant of that and represent ourselves in a way that best supports the inclusivity that Jose is talking about and enables people to utilize the services and create a system that is truly fair and equitable, rather than maybe, even if it's inadvertently, misusing our power or miscasting it or exercising it in a way that perpetuates those hierarchies or that limits people's ability to engage and really be included in a meaningful way.
And that power ties directly in with privilege, because those who are privileged will have more power within the society. And so what exactly is privilege? Privilege is a contextual benefit to one group of people versus another. A really good sort of analogy for this is what's being illustrated right here, which is the trash can analogy. A teacher in a classroom had their students lined up one row after the other, and put a trash can in the front and told them all to crumple up a piece of paper and make a basket into the trash can. And those who made it in got extra credit points, and those who didn't got minus. It was the same task that was being placed in front of them, but because of the way that they were sitting in the classroom, it was much easier for the students in the front of the row to be able to throw the piece of paper and make it into the trash can and to receive that benefit. It wasn't necessarily that they were so much better at shooting baskets than anybody else in the classroom. It's just that they were given this privilege by sitting in the front row, by being placed in the front row, or by random chance. This is the seat that they chose on the first day, and 3 weeks later they had this activity to do. And so that's a kind of an example of how privilege works, right? The further away you are, the harder it is to make that basket, the better you have to be at that task. You have to be so much better than the people sitting in the front row to be able to do the same task, because they are structurally privileged to you. Understand that privilege is contextual, that some person may have privilege in a certain situation and then not have privilege in another situation, depending on what that situation is like. This plays in a lot in society, and when we're talking about racism, that it goes back into the whiteness, right? So people who are white have privilege within the greater society here. They have that advantage simply because their skin is lighter than other people's. And then this is a really important concept to examine when you're going into a mediation, when you're going into a facilitation, when you're acting as a neutral third party. Who in this situation has privilege? What kind of privilege do they have? Do they have structural power privilege? Do they have social privilege, wherein they are more connected with the people who are involved in the dispute? Do they have a racial privilege? Is there something there that they are benefiting from? So it is good in your conflict resolution practices, or to examine the conflict resolution processes that you're involved in, whether that is your company's HR program, or how you handle solutions at home. How do you resolve conflict at home? What process do you have? What process are you involved in? And where does privilege play in that? Is age a privilege? Is it that the older they are, the more privileged they are, or the younger they are, the more privileged they are? It can go both ways. So you really need to examine, when you're entering into a dispute, or entering into some sort of conflict resolution process, where is the privilege, who has it, and what type it is. And so let's give this a little bit more context and examining racism in Hawaii. There has been a large myth that Hawaii is just better at this whole race thing. We've got tons of different types, so obviously there's no racism here. We live next door to each other. It's fine. And that's completely a myth. Racism exists here, but it is important, in order to understand the racism that exists in Hawaii on institutional, interpersonal, and all those levels, is to really understand, just as you would for the continent, understand the history of this place. You understand what the mix is, and how it happened. So there are certain cases that are very famous here, such as the Massey case, wherein the accusation of a white woman against local guys, or local looking guys, they were local guys, but they're local looking guys, caused a huge scandal, that they weren't believed, they were mistreated on her word, and race played a key part into it. And so really understanding the history of Hawaii will definitely help you with understanding current racist structures, current prejudices. The plantation system, how like the Big Five and businesses came in, and what their interactions were, and who they set up as sort of middleman on the plantation system, is something that's repeated today in a lot of people's inherent biases, as well as histories of like, when was the large surges of immigration into Hawaii. That's going to give you another revelation into where biases lie in current Hawaii, as well as looking into what was called the Hawaiian Cultural Renaissance. and who was leading that, and how did it get used in the mainstream, will help you to really understand that. In addition, there are the idea of sort of a racial paradise for anybody isn't necessarily true, right? The history plays along with that. Currently, Micronesians are often prejudiced against, but there is also anti-Blackism here in Hawaii. Part of that is because there isn't a large population, a large Black population, and many of that percentage is historically from the military, and then there's a whole history of colonialism that comes along with it. There was an article written during sort of the civil rights movement about how Hawaii was this paradise of racial equity, and how Black people could come to Hawaii and it would be okay because they weren't actively being murdered here. And that's like the lowest bar that you can really set for anti-Blackism, anti-Blackness, and that sort of idea, because they are like, the Black community is not in the mainstream. It's not really known very much. It's seen as a smaller community, and there is a lot of biases and prejudices that go along with it. So if you think about the history and the legacy of, you know, colonialism, racism here is very different, but not non-existent. And I think, Amrita, you wanted to add a little bit into that.
Well, I just wanted to echo that. And the reason we bring this up is, especially for those of us who do diversity, equity, and inclusion work, we often hear this chorus of, but it's better in Hawaii. We don't have problems, we're so diverse. But there's a wide gulf between diversity and equality and inclusion. And speaking as the former senior trial attorney for the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission here in Honolulu, we have plenty of racism, discrimination. We have these issues, and sometimes, frankly, having a more diverse society just gives us more opportunities to hit up against different identities. So we want to encourage it, and I think we have a group here that is really willing to engage with this very courageously and say, okay, well, we will acknowledge power, privilege, race, they all matter here in Hawaii just as much as anywhere else that we may come from or we may go to from the islands. However, it may look different. It may play out in different ways, but that's, again, everything Katie was educating us about. And just wanting to acknowledge two things sort of separately. We're covering a lot of big topics very quickly. Again, the goal here is really just to give us a little bit of an introduction so we can have a common vocabulary to talk about these issues with each other. And the second point is I really want to acknowledge and encourage the robust conversation that's happening in the chat. Thank you all for sharing your thoughts. And, you know, we want to encourage that as a good avenue to get us ready to have the in-person conversations that we're going to have in a few minutes.
100%. I love what's going on in the chat right now, talking about contextualism and different details into, you know, history and legacy and colonialism and military power here in Hawaii and how that affects everything. It's fantastic. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, just a reminder of what a great community we have to educate each other if we can really open ourselves up and challenge our assumptions and biases and be open to educating each other in that way. So we wanted to, before we break out, right, let's make this very relevant to those of us who do this work regularly. What does it mean then to take everything we've talked about, understand the concepts, and then use them to take a critical eye to the work we do? What does it mean to be anti-racist in examining our own practices, our behaviors, and the ways we approach conflict resolution? So we have a couple of examples here, and we can highlight them and talk a little bit from our experiences as well. But, you know, that first is really that idea of, and I'm going to invite Jose and Katie to unmute themselves as well and jump in, because this was really very a collaborative slide for all of us. But looking at, you know, what it means to, are you the appropriate person to mediate this dispute? Can you mediate yourself? Can you challenge your own assumptions? Be open to exploring your own biases with the acknowledgement that let's take the shame out of it. We all have these biases. How can we manage them, you know, make them explicit from being implicit so we can make sure that we are engaging in a way that the biases are not holding us back and preventing us from connecting and helping people solve their problems?
And there is a very long tradition of debating on, can we really be a neutral? Does neutrality exist? That has been a very long played out conversation within the conflict resolution field, with generally saying, no, not really. You do have your own biases, and being able to really mediate yourself. Give yourself a reality check. Ask yourself questions as though you were one of your clients within the situation that you're in. When you are finished with a project and you go through that time of self-reflection on what worked, what didn't work, maybe examining, were some of my own self-perceptions, were some of my own biases what played into both what worked and what didn't work, and why. And you can work on changing and adapting yourself into for these situations, so that you can truly be able to be the conflict resolver that the people who hired you or the people who are asking you to help really need you to be. So thinking about it in that way. I'm gonna just echo Jose's, lean into your discomfort. It's gonna be nasty. It can really get that way. But that's part of growth, right? And we're always trying to grow and learn.
And just to piggyback on that a little bit, so yes, there's a process. Definitely trust the process, but it's not, it's not just another session. It's not just you understand that there's a process of development, that a process of grief, that a frustration and anger that people go through in conflict, and you have to get them through that process. But it's okay if it gets uncomfortable. It's okay, because that means that hopefully by the end, we have grown, we have learned something different. And sometimes it's just back to basics of like, listen, learn, plan, then act. There's nothing in a textbook that, as much as you study the theory and the practice and you've trained, sometimes it's just the beauty of the moment. And that's, when the light bulb happens, the light bulb moment, and you make that connection. And sometimes it's okay to, I found times where I've had to, take the professional conflict resolver hat off and just share, yes, it's frustrating. Yes, it's exhausting. Yes, holding space for that frustration. And as much as a neutral as you tend to be, it's tough, because you will connect with some of these cases, some of these situations, and as rough skin and strong skin as you may be, like it will break your heart. You will cry. It's okay. It's okay to be personal, to be human. And if anything, the other individual may potentially, you may find a way to connect with the parties that you may have not been able to. Now, I'm not saying that you should go into every situation by letting the tears out firsthand, but if it gets to that point, it's okay to go outside of the mold that we perpetuate sometimes.
Yeah, and I just wanted to echo Jose's point too about the holding space and the being open to being flexible and perhaps redesigning your processes in order to make sure that everyone is getting the best benefit of it. But I wanted to specifically talk about working with co-mediators or facilitators as well, and give sort of two disparate examples. One is sort of more generally, I've had the opportunity to co-mediate with several more established white men here on island, here as mediators. And on one hand, some of the partnerships have been wonderfully successful. We've learned from each other. But there have been times too where I'm finding myself at this disadvantaged point as a younger looking woman of color, not being allowed to participate and being silenced and sort of being put in my place sometimes. Again, intentional or not, those are just the relationships that we have to be aware of. Think about how you can better engage with your co-mediator. The other example I want to give you is actually I had the privilege of co-mediating with Jose recently. And as he discussed earlier, he's being very cognizant of how he presents and what space he takes up in the room as a male and sometimes as a Latino or even a white presenting male. He made the choice in our co-mediation which involved a big group of a lot of actually women of color to take a step back and allow the women of color, their voices to really be elevated and to drive the conversation. And then at the end, he came back and he really made some very beautiful observations about that. So he very deliberately created space for me and others in the room to have a very productive conversation. So being aware of that and really being able to have a strong relationship with the person that you might be co-meeting, co-facilitating with, is just going to make the process better for everyone. So be mindful of that and engage, and that's a really positive way to think about how you can build more equity and get better assistance from each other and have a better process. Another example we have on the screen that we wanted to just touch base on really quickly is the idea of Robert's rules. This goes to the point about the systems that we hold dear, the processes that we are trained in are not always the right processes and sometimes can be fallible. This also goes to the point that when rules are written by a dominant group and for a dominant group, they may not always privilege everyone whose voices we're trying to bring to the table. Robert's rules is a system, it's a parliamentary system that was written and created and perpetuated primarily by white men, right? Like we can just say that. And I will share with you, I personally have had Robert's rules used in a way that has silenced me in board meetings and public meetings. And so we need to think about, I'm not here to say Robert's rules is bad. I'm here to say that we need to be very thoughtful about how we implement and rely on existing structures. For example, if we want to utilize something like Robert's rules, are we doing our part to make sure that everyone participating has the base understanding of what that is, how that operates, and how that's going to be expected? And if it is not working, if certain people do not feel empowered to speak because of this very formal system, what can we do differently? How can we shift our processes? Again, with the goal of making sure that voices are not silenced, even inadvertently, and making sure that we are not too heavily relying on existing practices or shortcuts or things that we are very quick and able to engage with. Maybe we need to be broader and we need to be challenged to think about, okay, just because you have always done it this way, you always use this specific model, what else can we do? How can we broaden this? Can we be open to that as peacemakers, as conflict resolvers and problem solvers?